Some of us seemed quite nervous about the Liberal social reforms in the revision session today, and the fact that I had to leave about half an hour early has meant that I've just decided to reteach you the Liberal social reforms. I don't have time to do it in class, so I'm doing it as a pre-record. So we're going to start by thinking about poverty in the late 1800s, so the late 19th century. And we start by acknowledging that poverty is not a new issue by 1900. People have been campaigning to alleviate the condition of the working poor for a long time before the 1900s, and we have evidence of people talking about, for example, overcrowding and the issue of working conditions and living conditions actually for centuries before the 1900s. But the reason that the condition of the working poor is so terrible in the 1900s is we have an incredibly high infant mortality rate, so 163 deaths. Sorry, I've got the hiccups. I drank squash very quickly. We've got 163 deaths per 1,000 babies being born. That is a really significantly high percentage. That's 10% of babies who are being born are dying. Generally speaking, infant mortality is a very good statistic to reveal the general health of the population. And what we have is the 1834 Poor Law. So the 1834 Poor Law sees the creation of the iconic Victorian institution, the workhouse. The workhouse is in my opinion, it functions primarily as a deterrent. The workhouse, in theory, is somewhere you can go and receive care and support and food and clothing. So you can see the picture on the bottom right hand side there. These are women in a workhouse. They're eating, they're clothed, they look vaguely healthy, I suppose. But ultimately, workhouses and prisons aren't that dissimilar. The function and the purpose of a workhouse is to punish the poor and try and inspire them to lift themselves out of poverty, which we know is a completely ridiculous idea, because the only way that people can truly lift themselves out of entrenched structural poverty is through significant government intervention. So the workhouse doesn't work, ironically. So I've talked about that. We see, so hopefully you'll remember Charles Booth from both year 12 and year 10 when you looked at the history of medicine. Charles Booth is a social reformer, and he works looking at the labouring poor in London, and he produces something quite astonishing in the poverty map. And he discovers that around 30% of the population in London are afflicted by what he refers to as abject poverty. So this map is colour-coded, where you can see the hotspots of like blue and black buildings, particularly sort of south of the river. Those are your hotspots of poverty. So the particular area that is very infamous by the 1900s is Whitechapel. So after the 1888 Jack the Ripper murders, people's attention really gets drawn to Whitechapel and how just god-awful the conditions in Whitechapel are, particularly for the working poor and particularly for poor women. So Charles Booth publishes his map and his text, and that work is echoed by Seaborne Rowntree, who is working in York. And Rowntree discovers that actually a very sort of eerily similar statistic in a percentage of people in York are living in poverty. He discovers that 28% of people in York are living in poverty, and he's particularly interested in food. So he's interested in malnutrition, and his definition of poverty is linked to adequate food supply. So the fact that both Rowntree and Booth, so working in York and London respectively, find that about 30% of the population, both in London and in York, are living in abject, entrenched poverty, reveals to the government that actually they need to do something. But don't think that the government is acting in alleviating the condition of the working poor because of altruistic reasons. They're not doing it because they actually care about the living conditions of the working poor. Mainly, the government is acting because of threats to the economy. Because if you have sick workers, you have unproductive workers, which means your profits go down. And that can't happen because capitalism. Now, the other thing that pushes the government into action is the Boer War. So 1899 to 1902, we've got about 33% of volunteers for the Boer War being rejected on medical grounds, which is a problem because it means the national efficiency of the country, i.e., how healthy the civilian population is and how useful they will be in times of war, is really problematic. So these things, so the workhouse, Charles Booth, the Boer War and Seaborne Rowntree are bubbling behind the scenes and putting pressure on the government to act and alleviate the living conditions and the working conditions of the labouring poor. Now, this is where new liberalism comes in, and we have Campbell Bannerman, who is Prime Minister between 1906 and 1909. No, I've just lied to you. 1906 and 1908. And we've got Henry Herbert Asquith, who becomes Prime Minister in 1908. Asquith is Chancellor of the Exchequer under Campbell Bannerman. So he is not some backbench person that has no identity in the Liberal Party. Everyone knows who he is. Everybody is supportive of his rise to prominence when Campbell Bannerman resigned. So, I don't want to talk about any of that. I've talked about that. Now, the other major loud voice in new liberalism is David Lloyd George. And David Lloyd George is known as the Welsh Wizard. And basically, he's just incredibly mouthy. And his reasoning behind the Liberal Party pursuing a programme of social reforms is very interesting. And he says, it's time we did something that appealed straight to the people. It will, I think, help stop this electoral rot. He's talking here about the potential bubbling threat from the Labour Party. Lloyd George talks at length, and I have the source. Actually, we could do it as a source question at some point, actually. It's quite a good one. Where David Lloyd George is talking about the fact that his justification behind social reform doesn't just come from a place of genuine concern. It also comes from the fact that if the working classes are miserable and living in god-awful conditions, of course they're going to turn towards the Labour Party, who is offering to reform their lives and make it better. And he argues that if the Liberal Party becomes the party of social reform and of improvement, then the Labour Party will serve no purpose. So he's saying that the Liberals might be facing electoral rot if they don't do something to compete with the growing, bubbling threat of Labour. But don't overstate the threat of Labour, because remember, they only have 29 seats in 1906, and that only gets to about 42 by 1910. So it's not significant. So don't overplay the threat of Labour if you're talking about motivations behind the social reforms. So, pensions are the first social reform that the Liberal government pursue. So, Asquith is actually working on the pension scheme when he's Campbell Bannerman's Chancellor. And the plan is a means-tested pension of 5 shillings to everybody who earns 5 shillings a week, to everybody who earns less than £21 a year, if they are older than 70 years old. That is then on a sliding scale from 5 shillings to 1 shillings for people who earn between £21 a year or around £21 a year or less, and £31 a year. If you earn £32 a year, you ain't getting no pension. Now, the main intention with the pension, it rhymes, I am a poet. The main intention with the pension is that it will supplement pensioners' existing income. The pension is supplementary. I need to see you using that vocabulary when you are writing about pensions and the Liberal social reforms. The pension is designed to supplement incomes, not replace them. So when pensioners start claiming the pension on their 70th birthday, they will still have to work because the pension just is not enough to live on. Even the maximum amount accessible to people, 5 shillings a week, is not enough to live on. So the positive about pensions is that it's non-contributory. So it's paid through direct taxation. And it doesn't disenfranchise you like accessing support under the Poor Law did. So if you, for example, access poor law support in 1902 and you ended up going to the workhouse or claiming some kind of unemployment benefit, you would have your right to vote stripped away from you. You would have less democratic rights than someone who wasn't reliant on the state. The pension, that doesn't happen. It's free from the stigma of the poor law, and also you claim it through the post office. So there's no stigma attached to the pension whatsoever. The problem is, though, what that leads to is more people than Lloyd George anticipated claiming the pension, because he bases his predictions based off how many people are claiming poor law support. And obviously a bunch of elderly people are not claiming poor law support because of the stigma. So when he's like, oh yeah, pensions, you can still vote and we're not going to stigmatise you and you can have this money, you're not going to die in a ditch. A bunch of pensioners come out of the woodwork and start claiming the pension, and Lloyd George is like, oh no, this is costing far too much. All of this is happening at the same time as the naval arms race with Germany. Lloyd George talks at length about the need to provide both for the elderly population of Britain, but also the need to build enough dreadnoughts to compete militarily with Germany. So he talks about needing to raise money to the tune of £400 million. Hence the People's Budget. But you can revise that after this. Now, this is Pat Thane. We love Pat Thane. She's my most favourite historian of 20th century Britain. And she says that the pension is for the very poor, the very respectable, and the very old. What she means by the very respectable is she's talking here... Is my highlighter going to work? If it does, I'll be so happy. It kind of works. That's actually really hard to do with the trackpad. Anyway, what she means by the very respectable is the idea that the Liberal Party are only trying to assist who they refer to as the deserving poor. So at this point, we have a distinction between the deserving poor, so the elderly, the sick, the disabled, the young, children, and the undeserving poor, so people with alcohol dependency, people with drug addictions, people who might engage in sex work, people who spend their money recklessly, according to the government. If you are deemed to be of ill repute, so you are, for example, you have a criminal record, you are prevented from accessing the pension. So ultimately, the pension is a step in the right direction, but it is just a safety net. It is not there with the intention of making the lives of elderly people genuinely significantly better. It's a safety net for the very poor, the very respectable, and the very old, and nothing more. Do not overstate how important the pension is. So the pension comes into being from the 1st of January 1909, and I've talked about that. So I've talked about all of this stuff already, but just have it in your head that the pension costs way more than Lloyd George thought it would, and that is what pushes him to enact the People's Budget in this very same year, that then kicks off the constitutional crisis and Lloyd George going to loggerheads with the House of Lords. Now, the other group of people that the liberal social reforms are trying to support are children. This is just a little bit on education pre-1906. You don't really need to have a huge amount of knowledge on this, but it would be useful to just have a general understanding of the limitations of education. There's no universal secondary education. Most children are educated to the age of 11 and then, or maybe even the age of about 9 and then no more. There's controversy over the role of religion within education. and education tends to reinforce your role in society's social hierarchy anyway. So the very wealthy and the very privileged are going to be able to mix in high society, and they're going to be educated in the very ancient subjects of mathematics, rhetoric, history, philosophy. And then your working class children will be taught to read and do basic arithmetic, but that's sort of it. Now, the Education Act, there are two Education Acts that I need you to know about. The 1906 Education Act and the 1907 Education Act. The 1906 Education Act provides free school meals funded by local rates, which is basically local taxation. The problem is, this act is permissive, and only about half of the local education authorities are actually providing free school meals by 1913. We don't see the mass rollout of free school meals until several decades later. I've got my laptop balanced on my dog, who is currently asleep after nearly chewing something scary, and now he's dreaming, so my laptop is shaking. This is not ideal. And yes, I do use my dog as a shelf. I'm a very nice, respectable dog owner, what can I say? Anyway, so the 1906 Education Act is positive in that some poor children are being fed, and this might potentially be their only meal of the day, but the operative word there is some. Not all children are able to access free school meals because not all local authorities are actually providing it because it's too expensive. We also have the 1907 Education Act, which is the provision of medical checks. So over their schooling years, between when they start school and when they leave school, each child should, in theory, be examined by a doctor 3 times, which sounds great, right? But the problem is, say, for example, little Susan. Susan gets examined by a doctor, and that doctor turns around to Susan's parents and goes, Susan has rickets. She's really malnourished, and if her diet isn't fixed, she's going to be really genuinely unwell. Susan's parents can't afford to feed Susan better food. They would if they could, but they can't. So it's all well and good having these medical inspections, but what isn't free and what isn't provided by the state is the actual medical treatment. Say the doctor turned around to Susan's parents and said she has typhoid. Susan's parents are like, okay, well, I can't afford the £3 that it's going to cost to get Susan treated at the doctor's. So the medical inspections are good in that they might uncover some problems, some medical problems, but the major downside is treatment is not provided. So it's like, okay, I know my kid has rickets, but I can't do anything about that because I can't afford it. So again, there is some progress here about the state having some kind of oversight of children's physical health by providing food and medical checks, but the limitations are really quite significant here. In terms of the working man, we have the labour exchanges. The labour exchanges are think about them as like an early 1900s job centre. The intention here is to match unemployed men with jobs that might be suitable to them. The problem is, this doesn't work because only about 25% of people who access the labour exchanges actually find a job through them, which means 75% of people do not find a job through them. It is a fundamentally unsuccessful piece of legislation. National insurance, in theory, also benefits the working man. You've got about 2.5 million people who are able to access national insurance or pay into national insurance. And the intention here is for a maximum of 15 weeks. If you have paid into the scheme for a certain amount of time, you will receive 7 shillings a week. And then after that 15 weeks is up, you're on your own. So in certain trades, this would be quite useful. If you were laid off because your shipyard closed down, and you needed a week or two to tide you over before you could get your job at your next shipyard, this is fine, this is great. The problem is, this doesn't address the issue of structural unemployment. If you are made unemployed because your entire industry is collapsing in on itself, and you can't find another job, this isn't going to help you. because you'll burn through that 15 weeks and you still don't have a job. So national insurance is great for people who contribute, but it doesn't help people who are struggling with structural unemployment, because the only way you can deal with structural unemployment is to completely reorient the economy to one of the new industries, which just isn't going to happen at this point because the government does not want to spend its money on revolutionising British industry. So, one of the things that the government does provide for the working man, or one of the things that the government does introduce for the working man, is the 1909 trade boards. This is basically the introduction of a minimum wage. It's initially in sweated industries, which basically means the very, very, very tricky, horrible, exhausting jobs like working in a textile factory or a mill or a mine or a shipyard or something that's really quite unpleasant and physically demanding. It would set you a minimum wage, which in theory is great because there's increased regulation and there's inspection and your quality of life is going to improve because, yes, you're doing a very dangerous job, but you're being more fairly compensated for it. But the problem is, there is a lack of enforcement. So some coal mines, for example, won't implement the minimum wage. Or, yeah, fair enough, it's great that I'm being paid more to work in a textile mill, but that doesn't solve the issue of my fingers getting mushed off because the machinery I'm using is fundamentally unsafe and no one is spending enough money to try and fix it. So, basically, what I'm wanting you to see here is that, yes, the Liberals are introducing social reform. However, it is never getting close enough to actually revolutionise people's lives. And we're nowhere near the introduction of anything like a welfare state. But the Liberals aren't trying to create a welfare state. The Liberals are all about the deserving poor. They're about creating a safety net. They're not trying to completely take responsibility for people's lives. Remember, these are Liberals. They are laissez-faire. They're about freedom and small government. They don't want the government to sweep in and to take complete responsibility for your well-being. That is anti-liberal. That is not liberal ideology. That's what the Labour Party would advocate for, the creation of a welfare state where the state does take responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. And that's why we see the creation of the NHS and reforms to national insurance and national assistance in 1946 to 1948, with the introduction of national insurance, like a revolution to national insurance in 46 and then the NHS in 48. But that's not what the Liberals are about. They're not trying to create anything like a welfare state at all. That is not their intention. That's Churchill being Churchill and actually talking really positively about social reform. I like this picture because he looks really odd with hair, to be honest. I'm so used to seeing him when he looks like an egg. And then here, it's like, oh, he's got hair. But I suppose he's already losing it. Anyway, less about Churchill's hairline. So, these are the major social reforms that I need you to know about. In a couple of lessons' time, I'm going to do a carousel do now where I ask you in detail to lay out the pros and cons of each of these attempts at social reform. I need you to be able to talk in detail about, for example, the limitations of the pensions. I need you to be able to talk in detail about, for example, the limitations of the Education Acts or national insurance or unemployment insurance. This is the layout. This is like the nitty gritty stuff for national insurance. So basically, national insurance is problematic because you do actually have to pay into it, which the trade unions see as wage theft. So the unions do not support contributory social reform. The BMA, the British Medical Association, also oppose it because they don't want their doctors to be considered puppets of the state. because part of the national insurance provision is free treatment from a doctor, which means that doctors would be on government payroll. They'd be working for the government. And the BMA don't want that because they want their doctors to be free agents who have autonomy over their own professional lives, and they don't want them to work for the government. This is something we'll come back to when we look at the NHS and Bevan going toe-to-toe against the very hostile, actually, BMA. The massive problem with national insurance, though, is that it doesn't include women or children or the vast majority of men, really, to be honest. You've got about 2.5 million men who are accessing national insurance, but if you're unemployed, you're not accessing it. And if you can't afford to contribute to national insurance, you're not accessing it either. So it's like, oh yeah, it's fine. I get 15 weeks of 7 shillings a week. Fantastic. But I can't afford to pay that. So now I've been made unemployed because my coal mine is shut down and I'm screwed. So that was an incredibly rapid recap of the Liberal social reforms. Go back and pause this and replay it in parts. If I've spoken too quickly, I do massively apologise. If you have any specific questions, please let me know. And yeah, hopefully that wasn't too terrible and confusing.